paper really originated in one of the launch events down at St David's, where we were talking about the relative importance of the Llyfr Gwedig Gyffredin and the Bible in Welsh. The Bible has this sort of iconic importance, but arguably the Book of Common Prayer in Welsh meant more to ordinary people. And Denzil said how wonderful how people would have been relieved and how wonderful it would have been for them to have, for the first time, the services in a familiar language. And I said, yeah, but hey, wait on a minute. People would have been quite familiar with the medieval Latin liturgy, you know. You really would be surprised how much people knew of the Latin liturgy in the middle. And we kicked this around a bit, and then Wynne very properly called us to order and said, this is turning into a private conversation. Can we get back to what we're supposed to be doing, which is launching the book? So we obediently got back. But I thought it might be interesting just to look a bit more at that question. I went down a real research wormhole on the early history of the Book of Common Prayer in England, and I emerged from it with the comforting conclusion that Denzil and I were both right, which is nice, isn't it? Yes. I was very relieved when I saw you were here. I thought, gosh, just as well. I must admit, it's taken me some way outside my own research specialism. I'm sure there are people here who know, well, in fact, I know there are people here who know a lot more than I do about the early history of the Book of Common Prayer. Mostly my research has been around visual sources for religious history in late medieval and early modern Wales. But I've always been intrigued and to some degree puzzled by the amount of text that is incorporated in visual images. I mean, what was it doing? What was the point of those orate pro anima inscriptions on medieval tombstones when 90%, 95% of the people seeing them would not have been able to read them? So I thought we could usefully look a bit at what text is doing in medieval visual sources generally. We can look at the extent of medieval literacy. We can remind ourselves about the hugely variant levels of literacy in the Middle Ages. We're rather apt to think of literacy in our modern sense as the ability to decode a page of unfamiliar text. If you can't do that, you're not literate. Medieval literacy is much, much more complex than that. I want to look at this as how the laity in the later Middle Ages approached and engaged with the liturgy. And this is something that I was lucky enough to be able to explore with that Experience of Worship project that John and Sally Harper from Bangor headed up. It's 12 years ago now. Not shocking. And then I want to look at the changes of the mid-16th century and see how they would have impacted on people who were, I would say, familiar with the Latin liturgy, comfortable with it, and suddenly had a liturgy in a totally unfamiliar language foisted upon them. It's all part of this big puzzle. It's one of the big puzzles of Welsh history. Certainly one of the big puzzles of 16th century Welsh history. How on earth did the Westminster government get away with it? We had no Pilgrimage of Grace, we had no Prayer Book Rebellion. Apparently we just stood and said, yeah, what? I can't believe it, really, but it happened. And I think that the way that people in Wales dealt with the Book of Common Prayer is part of that problem. Anyway, a little bit about text in medieval visual sources. The traditional idea that visual imagery is there as libri laecorum, books for the illiterate. Now, this has had a lot of recent criticism, and you're probably as aware of it as I am. The thing is that in a lot of cases, stained glass, tomb carvings, wall paintings, they're far too complex, and also they contain far too much text to justify this assumption. Athene Rice, for example, has argued that wall paintings don't do what a book would have done. Wall paintings do not actually present doctrine effectively. They don't tell stories coherently. What they are there for is to stimulate devotion. Now, this may not, of course, be true with wall paintings of something like the Seven Deadly Sins. But what is going on here? I mean, why on earth do you need... Here we have a very graphic depiction of the sin of lechery, with demons egging the young couple, go on, give her a squeeze. Why do we need the word luxuria when most of the people to whom this is directed couldn't read it in English, never mind in Latin? What is it doing? I think, I mean, it is partly identifying, but who needs that? It's adding weight. They will have been taught what the seven deadly sins are. It's something which clergy were required to teach their congregations. In a church like St. Carvan, in many churches, the clergy would have been able to point to it. And you would have seen that it was there written down in writing. And even if you couldn't decode the writing, you would know that the writing was telling you that this is important, this is reliable, this is valid. Sometimes the text is up there, seems to be as an explanation. A couple of English examples. This is St. Christopher at Wood Eaton in Oxfordshire, from that wonderful old website, which I don't think is there anymore, paintedchurch.org. And on this banner, which you can't really see in this photograph, Qui cette image verra ce jour de mal mort ne mourra. Whoever sees this painting will not die an evil death that day. So what it's doing is explaining the whole significance of having a St. Christopher image in your church. But again, why put something like that? Why pay for something like that when most of the people looking at it aren't going to be able to understand it? Again, I think it is partly this question of the text adding weight to the visuals. Another English example, the Doom at Pen in Buckinghamshire. This is from a series of photographs on Flickr. This is one of the ones that I don't have permission to show you. It's okay under educational fair use. It's not okay to put on the internet. You can't see it sufficiently clearly, but you see there are sort of banneroles coming out here. Venite benedicti patris mei, come ye beloved of my Father, ite maledicte in ignem aeternum, go into eternal hellfire. And then what the angels' banneroles are saying is surgite mortui, venite ad judicium, come ye, arise ye dead and come to judgment, which might actually have been familiar to some of the audience through the fact that they appear in some of the mystery plays of the Last Judgment. Don't think they appear in the Welsh one that survived, but they might have appeared in ones that didn't. So there are a huge number of reasons why text might have been incorporated in medieval visual sources. There's a huge amount of text on tombs. There is text in medieval stained glass. There's also implicit text. The sequence of wall paintings from the church at Llandalw Talabont, which has been rebuilt at the Museum of, what are they calling it now? Museum of Welsh Life. I lose track, they keep changing the name. St. Fagans, anyway. I don't actually think we reflected this sufficiently carefully when we designed the present sequence of wall paintings that's in the reconstructed church. Because as far as we could see, the surviving wall paintings were a meditation on the crucifixion story told through the actual artifacts, the instruments of the Passion. And we did have a feeling that there might have been an underlying text that was not, in fact, painted onto the wall, but that was a Welsh equivalent, maybe, of the English meditation on the instruments, the poem O Vernical. So text doesn't even have to be written down. Wales is an intensely oral culture. Text could be something that was read to you, something that you learned, something that you spoke, rather than something that you read. then did people learn to recognise these bits of text in wall paintings, in stained glass, on tombs, if they weren't actually literate as we would understand the term? How people learned what they learned. I came across a very useful University of Toronto thesis by a man called Andrew Reeves, teaching the Creed and Articles of Faith in England, from Lateran IV to Ignorantia Sacerdotum. And I think, I mean, he focuses on England, but I think a lot of what he's saying is also applicable to Wales. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 led to a drive to make sure all the laity knew the Apostles' Creed and the other basic articles of faith. And this is something which Archbishop Peckham then picks up on in 1291 in his canon Ignorantia Sacerdotum, in which he required priests to preach 4 times a year on the Creed, the commandments, the works of mercy, the deadly sins, the virtues, and the sacraments. And that people were to be taught as a minimum the Creed, the Paternoster, and the Ave Maria. And it's quite clear from books like Anna Modd Hwn that you learned these texts first in the vernacular, and then you learned them to do them properly in Latin. Now, you would have known them, and you would have known that was what, you would have known from the painting that that's what the text said. We now identify the painting from the text. They would have identified the text from the painting. If you have something like, this is stained glass of the Annunciation at Llandudnog in the Vale of Fluid, and you know, here he's got this little banner, Ave Maria, Dominus Tecum. You would have known that was what it said because you'd learned it, and you would know that was it saying it. And while you couldn't decode unfamiliar text, I think there is a possibility that you would eventually have come to recognise at least little bits of text that you knew, even if it was only the initial A and M, which are often picked out in larger letters, special colours. It's rather like the way children often learn to read nowadays, by knowing a specific letter. My little grandson, who is 3.5, he can recognise the letter S because his name is Seth. You could imagine how you could develop that. You could recognise the A and the M of Ave Maria, and then you would know that was what it was all about. Perhaps slightly more complicated, you might have been able to recognise and associate with the text the clauses of the Apostles' Creed. And the thing about the Apostles' Creed being that, according to very early Christian tradition, it was actually written by the Apostles themselves before they dispersed after Pentecost, and they are frequently depicted in medieval art with their clauses of the Creed. And again, you wouldn't necessarily be able to read that. Difficult enough to read it as it is. But if you could identify the apostles by their emblems, and you knew which clause belonged to which apostle, you could then, again, a bit like my little grandson, he knows the book off by heart, so he can read it to you. So text is recognisable from the image. It's recognisable from individual letters. And you've got a whole range of varying levels of literacy. You've got the ability to recognise 1 or 2 letters. You've got the ability to recognise text once you know it. Lena Walgan-Smith down in Southampton University is doing some very good work, which I don't think she's actually published yet, on inscriptions on tomb carvings, epitaphs, commemorative poetry and so on, from the later Middle Ages. And she said that there must have been an ability to recognise individual letters, an ability to recognise phrases, And there's also she says there is a perceptible increase in Latin literacy generally in the later Middle Ages. We know from various sources, from things like poetry, the poetic literature in Wales, the importance of preaching, especially by the friars and the Augustinian canons. We've got quite a bit of vernacular literature. I mean, this admittedly is fairly elite stuff, things like the Book of the Anchorites and Llandewi Brevi, which really does give you an overview of the devotional reading of an educated layman. But there are also books like Yn Ymod Hwn. In this way, a man is taught how he should believe and love God. And that may have been originally intended as a book for the clergy. This was how they would teach their congregations. It goes through the things like the 10 Commandments, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 sacraments. It's got a paraphrase of the Creed. It's got a list of the 7 corporal works of mercy. But then again, it obviously gets rewritten for lay readership as well. Okay, that is elite. That's people who are already literate. But if you look at the poetry of the period, this is poetry written for public, well, it's not even written, some of it, it's composed and written down later. It's composed for public performance. It's meant for a wide audience. And the poets themselves imply a wide knowledge of sacred texts. Griffin Aberyned Coch is good on this in the earlier part of the period, and we've said quite a bit about it in the book, so I shall brandish the book at you. He's got a poem in which he invokes the aid of a huge list of saints, as well as invoking the aid of the Trinity. And it resonates with the litany that would have been part of the Easter celebrations. So Griffin Aberyned Coch has obviously picked up on this, and it's become part of his poetic language. Similarly, in an ode, a poem addressed to Christ, he actually enumerates the 7 deadly sins, but then he goes on to talk, without telling you what they are, about the 7 petitions of the Lord's Prayer, the 7 virtues, the 7 words of Christ on the cross. I mean, the point is, he expected his audience to know what he was talking about. He didn't have to tell them what the 7 petitions were. He didn't have to tell them what the 7 last words from the cross were. He could just allude to them in passing. They were expected to know what these things were. And then later on, in the late 15th, early 16th century, just one other example, Iorwerth Fyngloed, who is a South Wales poet, writing in praise of St. Bride, St. Bridget. He's writing, I think, at the behest of the church at St. Bride's Major in Border Vale of Glamorgan. And he conflates the Welsh and Irish Bridgets. He also conflates them with St. Bridget of Sweden, so that he can bring in the 15 O's of St. Bridget, which are a meditation on the crucifixion. But again, he doesn't tell you, this is what St. Bridget said, bum, bum, bum. He just refers to it in passing. The assumption is that his audience, who are presumably the congregation of St. Bride's Major in the Vale of Glamorgan, know exactly what he's talking about. They know what the 15 O's of St. Bridget were. How many of us could do that? I couldn't. So people were educated. We shouldn't consider that the traditional idea was that the poets were doing all this stuff because the clergy weren't doing it properly. But when you really get to grips with what the poets are saying, they're not really conveying basic instruction. They're assuming that basic instruction has already been done, so they can go on and build on it. And they can use language which resonates with it, and people will know exactly what they're talking about. So again, it's literacy of a sort. It's not literacy on the written page, but it is literacy of a sort. How well would people actually have known the liturgy in the church? Now, when we did this experience of worship thing back in 2011, John Harper's idea was that he wanted to workshop how late medieval church services worked. First of all, in a cathedral, I mean, they used Salisbury Cathedral, but also how would you have scaled that down for a small rural parish church? So obviously they used the church from Llandough that had been rebuilt at St Fagans. And it was partly an exercise in logistics. You've got all this kit. What do you do with the bowl for washing your hands when you're not actually using it? Where do you put all the bits and pieces? Where do you put the cruets? Where do you put things? It was an amazing project to be involved with. It had a bit of a weakness in that I don't think it spent enough time exploring the congregational aspect of what was going on. We were told as congregation what we ought to be doing, what we should be thinking. We all know what congregations were actually doing in church in the later Middle Ages. When you weren't sat in pews in a row, you could mill around. And the fact that people were so frequently told off for gossiping, flirting, arguing, doing business deals, sleeping, doing all sorts of things. The fact that they were repeatedly told off for doing this, I think, rather suggests that they did. Nobody else in the congregation, unfortunately, was actually prepared to be naughty. So I had to be naughty for everybody. And John Harper did his best to keep me under control by putting me in role as an elderly maidservant in the big house. So I had to be a little more imaginative after that. But we had a lot of fun. Now, this is a photograph from the Experience of Worship website. You can see from this, yes, we are rather remote from, this is High Mass at the high altar. We are somewhat detached from what's going on, but we are paying attention. And a screen grab from the video, so it's not very good, but at crucial points in the service, we were all called in by the Sanctus Bell, and we had our little prayer to say at this point, and we were told what we were supposed to be doing, and we felt we could see what was going on behind the screen, even though we couldn't really hear it terribly well. But that wasn't the only service in the church. Like most churches, like even quite small churches, the church at Llandough had side altars. They would have been in frequent use in the week for votive masses, commemorative masses. Here we are at Jesus Mass, and you can see the congregation are practically on top of the celebrant. A couple more screen grabs. And here, the reading of the epistle, I think this was. Here we are. We're practically sitting on top of the altar. And we could hear what was going on quite well. Even the secret of the Mass, even the bits that the priest was supposed to say quietly because they were so holy, could hear perfectly well. Now, if you attended weekly Mass frequently enough, you would know the words. And you would then know what was going on at the high altar, even though you couldn't really hear it terribly well. And the Mass was not the only liturgy that you would have been familiar with. For some people, it was a part of their daily life that they prayed the hours. We know that some of these daily services, the sevenfold daily office, were translated into Welsh. The best known example is the Office of the Blessed Virgin Mary, which is specific readings and antiphons for the Virgin Mary, and that crops up in books of hours. But there was also the very frequently used office of the dead. There was the office for the commendation of souls, which would have been surprisingly well known. A medieval deathbed. This is from one of those wonderful books of advice on how to die a good death. We need to know about these things. The Ars Moriendi, and I got this one from the Diocesan Library in Nancy in France. They're given permission for use in lectures, but not for putting on the internet. And this is a medieval deathbed. And you can see that the priest has come to give the dying person their final communion, the viaticum. There are angels around the bed. There's a devil being driven under the bed. There's a member of the household kneeling in prayer. But you see, the neighbours have all piled in to support the dying person. And there was quite a complicated liturgy, which you were supposed to say around the bed of a dying person. After the dying person themselves had made their final confession, received absolution, received the anointing with oil, received their final communion, recited the Apostles' Creed, there were the 7 penitential psalms, there's an enormously long liturgy. Then there's the prayer of commendation, set forth Christian soul from this world, which is the one that crops up in the Dream of Gerontius. You only need, these are all people who are ready to take part in that liturgy. And you only needed one person with the Book of Hours. And everybody else could just respond to the bits they could respond to. And again, do that often enough, and you will get familiar to it. Ordinary people knew their liturgy. This again is an example from England, and it's a rather late example, but Judith Maltby in that book on the prayer book and the English people mentions some really quite ordinary people, quite poor parishioners in York during Mary's reign. They were actually able to criticise their priest for leaving out bits of the daily office. And they were also able to criticise him because his Latin was so bad, he was garbling the rest. They knew perfectly well what he should have been saying and how he should have been saying it. And he wasn't doing it. And they ratted on him. But this is what they knew what they were doing. Liturgical fragments crop up in stained glass and in wall paintings. This is part of the story of John the Baptist from the stained glass at Gresford in North Wales. And you see you've got Salome, who's obviously got her frock back on. She's got the head of John the Baptist. Underneath, Domine mi rex, da mihi indisco caput Johannes Baptista. Oh, my Lord the King, give me in a charge at the head of John the Baptist. A biblical quote, yes. It's one of the antiphons for the feast of the beheading of John the Baptist. This is someone who knows to that level of liturgy. Another English example, the allegory of the fate of the souls at Swanbourne in Buckinghamshire. You've got 3 souls in purgatory pleading to their friends to help them in these words from the book of Job, Miseremini me, saltem vos amici me, which are one of the readings from Lords of the Office of the Dead. Again, someone who knows their liturgy down to that level. And at Tintern, to a man called Thomas Phillips. I've put the drawing because this has been in the open air for over a century and it is now completely illegible. And it took me quite a while to figure out what the inscription was doing. Can you just see something anime eius Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, but not as you'd expect from the Mass. Miserere anime eius, have mercy on his soul. Christe Jesu, miserere anime eius. Here's the full thing. It's one of the concluding passages of the Great Litany in this liturgy for the commendation of the soul that you would have said around the deathbed. So again, this is someone who knows, whoever commissioned this to, whether it was Thomas Phillips himself or one of his family, they know down to that level of the liturgy. And although these are examples of fairly elite people, because those are the people who have left this kind of record, I think what we're looking at is what Brian Stock, in his book The Implications of Literacy, has described as textual communities. He's talking of an earlier period. He's talking about the 11th and 12th centuries, but I think the concept is still valid right up to the end of the Middle Ages. Members of a textual community are aware of the importance of text. They may none of them be literate in the modern sense, but they have the ability to recognize text, recognize it has meaning, and recognize it has importance. Now, that meaning may be communicated to them orally, but it is essentially rooted in and validated by the written word. So that's what these bits of text in a lot of medieval visual sources are doing. They are validating what people are given orally. So he says consuming the written word was not a private but a social activity. You've got this carrying on into the Reformation period, haven't you? I mean, you've got people like that Cardiff fisherman, Rawlins White, who heard the Bible being preached, couldn't say, I'm too old to learn this newfangled lark. It's a bit like me trying to cope with QR codes. He sent his little boy to school to learn to read, and the boy read the Bible to his father, and his father learned the Bible because he couldn't read it, he learned it. So, you know, that was a small textual community. He went on to preach it, and he was eventually martyred. What then happens to this world of understanding Latin text at the Reformation? What happens more specifically, when the 1549 and then the 1552 prayer books are imposed on a 90% monoglot Welsh population? It is, as I said, part of this great problem of how on earth did they get away with it. Glanmor Williams's answer was that they probably went on using the Latin service and they mumbled a bit more than they usually did. I hate to disagree with Glanmor, but I'm not entirely sure that that works. There are examples of that happening in England. John Hooper, for example, who went on to become Bishop of Gloucester, complained to the European reformer Heinrich Bullinger that in some parishes that he'd come across, I think he's talking about London, the Lord's Supper was being celebrated 3 times a day. The fact that the prayer book said the priest had to control who had access, because if you were a notoriously evil liver, you weren't supposed to, that this was being used to evade the instruction that it was to be a congregational communion, and he complained that the liturgy was being said quietly, so nobody could really hear what was being said. So it's possible, but the problem is, of course, that the 1549 prayer book is not a translation. It's a complete reconfiguration of the liturgical landscape. So just using the Latin and mumbling isn't going to cut it. There have been some earlier examples of, well, things like translations and the cleaning up of the primer, and Cranmer's 1544 translation of the Litany. And there's the 1548 English pre-communion exhortation and confession. We know of no Welsh examples. We know of no surviving examples of those that could have been used in Wales. We perhaps need to look a bit harder. But as far as we can see, 1549, Pentecost, between a Saturday night and a Monday morning, would have been an awful shock in Wales. The sevenfold office, the hours, are merged into morning and evening prayer. There are much longer Bible readings. The idea is to get through the whole Bible in a year. Cranmer had this touching expectation that once people were told they could all come to communion, they would all want to come to communion. No. So communion was only supposed to take place when there was a congregation there. So it theoretically couldn't have happened that often. I mean, in most parishes, 3 times a year maybe. It's surprisingly difficult to find out what was done in England. You could say the communion service up to a certain point, then stop if no one was actually going to receive. In the 1549 prayer book, a lot of the ritual movements, the kneeling, the crossing, the raising of hands, are still allowed. The only thing that's specifically forbidden is the elevation of the host. So, you know, it's a kind of transition process. And Dermot McCulloch says quite a bit about the adaptations between 1549 and 1552, partly because, I think, of Cranmer's awareness that people just weren't coming to communion. Therefore, you had to do something to tweak the service so that it worked, even if you weren't going to have a communion service. There's rewording of the opening part of morning and evening prayer so that it's more for congregational worship. And the 1549 translates, well, the Latin is Domine labia mea aperies, O Lord, open thou my lips. And that Cranmer translates as, O Lord, open thou my lips, and my mouth shall show forth thy praise. By the 1552, it's what we're more familiar with, O Lord, open thou our lips, and our mouth shall show forth thy praise. So he's moving it from private devotion to congregational worship. Similarly, O God, make speed to save me becomes, O God, make speed to save us. O Lord, make haste to help us. He reorganized the communion service, so he took out the opening psalm, he put the main intercessions in the first half of the service. He imported the 10 Commandments into the first half of the service. He moved the Gloria to the end. So, you know, you can see he's kind of shiggling it around so that it works if you only use that up to the point at which you start actually the communion liturgy. I mean, all these changes in wording, they're hugely freighted with theological meaning, but would any of that have had any impact at all on monoglot Welsh speakers? So in theory, what you ended up with by 1552 was, again, Dermot McCulloch describes it as a 2-hour marathon on a Sunday morning, and that's without a sermon. If there was a sermon, it would have been a 5-hour marathon. Morning prayer, followed by the litany, then the communion service up as far as the prayers for the church, possibly followed by a couple of collects. And there was a lot of elements of other services as well. You lost a lot of the baptism service, including the use of chrism. Again, the baptism service has a lot of changes between 1549 and 1552. You lost the whole deathbed ritual, extreme unction, the last communion. The sick could only have communion if other people were there present to receive with them. You lost the prayers for the dead in the burial service, which is one of the things that sparked the prayer book rebellion in the West Country in 1549. Why didn't we rebel in Wales? Who knows? What happened in Wales? And, well, as I say, we don't really know. We don't, unfortunately, have anything like church wardens' accounts. And the earliest surviving set of church warden accounts for Wales from 1558 onwards is Swansea, which was largely Anglophone. If you look at the other languages sections of books on the history of the Book of Common Prayer, they don't include Wales. I mean, this is partly the sort of for Wales see England mentality, but I think it's also the fact that it is so difficult to figure out what on earth was happening at parish level. There were get-outs of sorts. The preface to the prayer book from 1549 onwards says, talking about morning and evening prayer, though it be appointed in the aforewritten preface that all things shall be read and sung in the English tongue, yet it is not meant that when men say matins and evensong privately, they may say the same in any language that they themselves do understand. Now, I think this was obviously a gesture in the direction of the continental reformers, a lot of whom had fled to England after the defeat of the Schmalkaldic League at Mulberg in 1547. People like Martin Butzer, who became a prof at, I can't remember, was it Oxford or Cambridge? It was Cambridge, thank you.
Either one.
Yes, I mean, at that date it wasn't going to be Lampeter, was it? But I don't think, he presumably learned functional English, but he didn't learn the level of English that he would need for academic life. When Cranmer wanted Butzer to critique the Book of Common Prayer, he had to translate it back into Latin for him. So, I mean, presumably that's what that is directed at, but it would have given you, technically, permission, if you had the intellectual capacity to translate that from Cranmer's English into Welsh, to use morning and evening prayer. And William Salesbury's Cynefeillydd ar Ban translated the prayer book Gospel and Epistle readings in the communion service. But as far as we can see, the English Book of Common Prayer was imposed at parish level. Arthur Buckley, who was Bishop of Bangor in the 1540s and early 1550s, to give him credit, I mean, he's the first person who explicitly said that his clergy were to use Welsh in instructing their congregations. I think the implication of an ymweld hwn is that it already, that was custom and practice. But he's the first person who actually said, you will use Welsh. But as far as we can see, I mean, his 1551 visitation articles insist on the use of the Bible and the prayer book in English. And there's plenty of evidence from poetic criticism that that is actually what was done. Now, Sean Bloynard has that poem of criticising a priest who says the words that he doesn't understand, and it was a traditional understanding of that was that it was because the priest didn't understand Latin. I think it's actually much more likely he's having a pop at someone who's using the prayer book in English and hasn't really got the faintest idea what he's saying. The 1549 prayer book was, well, you could say it was a bridging exercise, you could say it was a short-term compromise. There's a lot of wiggle room in it. The 1552 wasn't published until the October of that year. Spring of the following year, Edward died on the 6th of July. And by the end of August, the Latin Mass was back. And Sean Bloynard again, his poem, Were Vraint a Saint and Neshai, behold once more the privilege of the saints draws near, behold the old masses, behold God making us whole with his right hand. I mean, there is, you have to be careful about the poetry. They're only speaking for themselves, really. But nevertheless, there is such a perceptible sense of relief in that. We're back to normal. And then Mary dies, Elizabeth comes to the throne. The 1559 prayer book is largely the 1552 with a few tweaks. What would the expectations have been? Would people have expected it to last? Elizabeth nearly died of smallpox early in her reign. She would probably have been succeeded by Mary Queen of Scots. We might have had the old mass back again. We don't know how invested people were. But as far as we can see, at parish level, what was being used in Wales was the English Book of Common Prayer. And then, in 1567, the Llyfr Gweddig Gyffredin and the New Testament in Welsh, it must have come as a huge relief. I think perhaps not so much a revelation as a reassurance. The generation that was really familiar with the Latin liturgy would have been dying out. There had been nearly 20 years of confusion, much of it dominated by unfamiliar services and uncertainty. And then you get the prayer book and the Bible in your own language. Yes, it must have been wonderful. There's some debate over how participatory the services are. I mean, if you used to Anglican church services nowadays, there's a fair amount of congregational participation. And I used to find it very difficult to explain to my students, even those who went to church, how different things were in the 16th century from the way that they are now. It seems to have varied, according to something which John Harper wrote in the book edited by Paul Barnwell. The prayer book services are mainly said by the minister in alternation with the parish clerk. But Judith Maltby quotes a number of examples. These are all England again, I'm afraid, where some or all of the congregation are responsible for making the responses in the commandments, in the litany. I think if England is anything to go by, it would have taken time to bed in. But bed in it did. And it did become more participatory. By the early 17th century, there were things like Edmund Priest's Salmai Khan, metrical versions of the Psalms in Welsh, which the whole congregation could sing. And we know that in 1642, a petition went from North Wales, the 6 counties of North Wales, to the Long Parliament. The petition claimed 30,000 subscribers. I mean, this may have been a little bit of journalistic exaggeration. But they are petitioning in defence of the Llyfr Gweddi Gyffredin. I mean, the petition is in English, but it's clear that it's the Welsh Book of Common Prayer that they're talking about. And they talk about their full persuasion of the lawfulness of that which is prescribed according to the word of God, and the many years in the practice thereof, and the fact that even the threat of change had produced perplexity and grief. The thought that the threat of change is going to produce perplexity and grief, I think it's a very Anglican reaction. But there was clearly no desire, no great desire for further change. And it is hard to, it's hard for us to accept, it's hard for us to take account of in our sense of national identity, I think, how very traditionalist and how very loyalist Wales was in the 16th and 17th centuries. And, you know, we have to ask ourselves, how, why, and when did the great change happen? But there I am here trespassing on dental territory, so